Thank you.
So we are going to discuss the business of death in the mid-19th century. It seems like it's kind of a strange topic, but it's interesting to see the different ways people decided they were going to make money based on a very terrible experience for others. So we're going to, the one thing that all life forms have on Earth is that they are all going to die. We will all die. Flowers will die, animals will die. Human death in the 19th century was fairly common, and with the changes brought by the Industrial Revolution, it did not take long for individuals to begin commercializing with the process of death. This presentation is going to look at some of the occupations that developed around death in the 19th century. Unfortunately, we don't have time to discuss the details of funeral or mourning customs. That's another rabbit hole that we need to go down, which is really interesting. We will generally concentrate on just some of the occupations associated with death and burial. So to get an idea of how the commercialization of death progressed, let's look at how death was dealt with in the early 19th century. So early in the 19th century, the community came together to deal with the chores of death. The community sat with the dying, prepared the body for burial, and dug the grave. Preparation of the body, or cleaning it basically, usually fell to women, even for male corpses. It was common enough for the women to do this in the 19th century that they actually made a professional occupation of it. If you'll notice in these city directories for Philadelphia, I have 3 different years here. And there are individuals, I only pulled out 1 or 2 individuals from each year rather than all the different ones, but they're listed as a widow, layer out of the dead, meaning that she would go to the home, lay out the corpse, clean it, and do everything that needed to be done before it was buried. We have Rachel Gable, I should say. She was also a layer out of the dead. And Anne Askins, she was also a layer out of the dead. And as you continue to go through these directories, they start to kind of fade out of the directories around the 1860s. They weren't as popular, or they weren't as well represented in the directories at that time. The burial usually took place from the home in the early 19th century, and or at the community churchyard. They were usually buried at the churchyard. In some communities, though, you did tend to bury people out in the backyard, which is kind of fun, actually, because now we're finding all these hidden cemeteries and burial grounds in places where old houses stood. The coffin was built by the men of the community, and the men carried the body to the grave if it wasn't too far, or they would lend their wagon to transport. In the 1830s, men began offering services to undertake the task associated with death. At this point, few women were employed as undertakers. Those women listed in city directories had typically worked alongside their husbands and only appeared under their own names after the husband had died. And it was still not common to see female undertakers listed in the directories. African Americans are also listed as undertakers, serving all populations, not just the Black communities. We're going to talk about an African American undertaker here in a little bit. Undertaking was often a sideline business. In addition to other enterprises that the undertaker may be involved in, such as making coffins, furniture, or cabinets, operating liveries, even general stores. Church sextons also got into the business as furnishing undertakers, meaning they provided the materials needed by the undertaker to perform his duties. So if you notice, if you look at this slide here and this gentleman's advertisement, he is an undertaker, but he is also a manufacturer. He has curled hair. African fiber, I'm not sure what that is exactly. Husk and seagrass, mattresses, spelled wrong, and spring beds and old furniture repaired. So he had quite a few fingers and quite a few pies besides just the undertaking. So what did they do? Undertakers did about everything needed for the funeral and burial, including providing for and arranging for preparation of the body. Remember, the women are starting to fade out eventually for the preparing the body. They reached out to people to arrange the embalming, if embalming was requested, providing burial containers, and there were several containers available. Transportation to the grave, and even pallbearers if needed. I do want to really quickly, I don't know how many of you understand what a pallbearer is and why it's called a pallbearer, because they're obviously carrying the coffin. So in the Roman times, a soldier would carry a cape or a cloak called a pallium. In medieval times, the term pallium was shortened to pall, and Christians would use a pall to cover their loved ones when burying them. Thus, the term pallbearer is used to signify someone who bears the coffin covered by the pall. So it's the drape that's over the coffin. Sorry. This particular gentleman here with this advertisement, he advertises that he provides burial items such as nameplates, shrouds, and gloves. Usually a pallbearer would be issued gloves by the family. He had a hearse and carriages for the funeral, so he did not have to rent them. He could just offer them to the family. He had available coffins in the best style, always on hand, invitation, refrigerators, believe it or not. They had several ways of keeping a body fresh until the funeral. Embalming using Dr. Holmes' process. We're going to talk about Dr. Holmes here in a little bit. He also mentions, we are here also to state that there is nothing about the embalming of a lady by this process that is in the least repugnant to the nearest friend. So he wanted to make sure that it was okay if women were embalmed, even though they may be nude. Okay, I do want to introduce you to William Bell. He was in New Orleans between 1854 and 1866. He was born around 1814 in Inverness, Scotland, and came from a family of drovers, similar to a U.S. cowboy. That occupation saw a decline with revolutions in agriculture and transportation, and Bell relocated to Canada in the 1830s, and then to New Orleans, where he entered the livery trade. By the 1840s, he operated the Union stables from which he rented horses and carriages and also made carriages. In 1854, Bell is listed in the New Orleans City Directory as an undertaker. So he's following that same path. He had other things that he was doing, and then he followed that path into an undertaker position. The Civil War provided a new opportunity for Bell. As men were killed often far from home, Bell began locating, disinterring, embalming, and shipping the bodies home. Varnish dealers Minnick and Co. of New York served as Bell's commission agents, took payments, and oversaw the shipping of the bodies. He also advertised in various newspapers, and clients contacted him directly for help in locating buried people. Remains in New Orleans were easy enough to locate and disinter, but soon Bell was receiving requests for help to find burials further away. It was necessary then to contact Army officials for information and hire someone to make the trip and recover the body. The majority of the remains Bell shipped were sent to New England and New York. For some reason, those parts of the country seemed to rely on his services more. Bell did not just provide services to Union soldiers. It is known from his papers that he buried at least one Confederate prisoner, an African Americans, and then a child. During the Civil War, the cost of embalming a soldier differed by rank. However, Bell did not differentiate between officers and enlisted men. His base price to take up a body in New Orleans, embalm it, and ship it in a hermetically sealed coffin was $75. He would add $30 to $50 if the remains were further away, and another $25 if he required a receiving vault while waiting for shipping instructions. Bell would occasionally offer discounts for his services under certain circumstances such as the poverty of the family. Bell was using metal coffins from I.C. Schuler of Amsterdam, New York. However, during the Battle of Port Hudson, he notified Schuler that he could no longer use his metal coffins as the bodies arrived in New Orleans swelled up so much from the summer heat that they would not fit. Bell then relied on manufacturing custom wooden caskets lined with zinc. He was not the most successful undertaker in New Orleans. Pierre Cazenave, a free African-American and probably the first Black undertaker in New Orleans, was clerk for Judah, I'm going to scramble this name, Toro, who left Cazenave a $10,000 inheritance. He used the money to set up his undertaking business in 1854. By 1864, his net worth was said to be $100,000, and most of his clients were white. Thomas Bothick was an Irish immigrant who also opened an undertaker business in 1854. He claimed to be the leading undertaker in New Orleans and the South. According to the 1870 census, he was worth $64,000, whereas Bell in the same sentence is listed with an estate of only $20,000. Bell seems to have quit the business by 1866, as he is no longer listed in the city directory and his advertisements disappear from the newspapers. He died in July 1874 in St. Louis, Missouri. His body was shipped back to New Orleans and eventually entombed in Metairie Cemetery with two of his brothers in 1882. So, as you can imagine, based on the figures that we gave with Mr. Bell, that dying could be expensive in the 19th century. So this bill from 1853 is an example of the cost of the high-end burial. Let me see if I can get, I was trying to get this out of this screen thing out of the way so you could see the whole picture. So we have a very superior red cedar coffin covered with fine black cloth with silver lace and molding on top and bottom edge lined and padded for his daughter, for Harriet Lamb. This was I'm sorry? This was in 1853. There we go. Then we had, that was just for the coffin. Now we had various other expenses, such as additional fabrics, including crepe, a pillow for the coffin, silver nameplate, ice and ice box, handkerchiefs, gloves, portage to the cemetery, burial expenses, rental of the hearse, 8 carriages, men as carriers. I'm assuming that's either carrying it to the grave like a pallbearer or carrying it from the funeral home to the carriage, and female services and toll expenses. So the whole cost of this young girl's funeral in 1853 was $282.04. And that was still quite a bit of money in 1853. Then there is this one, which is a little bit cheaper. This one was from 1893. And it was only $90. So she got for the casket $50, funeral car, coaches, services, embalming and preserving the body was only $5. And the other stuff was only like $1 for chairs and $1 for gloves. So costs did go down a little bit as the 19th century wore on. So let's look at embalming. An embalmer could be an undertaker, a partner in an undertaker's firm, or an independent contractor. Embalming has been around for centuries, but the embalming we are familiar with began as a way to preserve cadavers for medical study. It was not unheard of for embalming to take place in the home rather than removing the corpse to the embalmer's place of business. In Appalachia mining areas, the company store may have offered embalming services. Embalmers typically used arsenic, mercury, and zinc-based compounds. Embalming would not require formal education in the US until the 1880s. However, in the 1840s, the history of embalming, written in 1834, was translated from its original French into English, and a second edition was published in 1843. And the book included instructions on how to embalm a body. So it's basically embalming for dummies. The process was not well accepted until the Civil War, and the need to preserve bodies for transportation arose. Prior to the war, undertakers also used a cooler or corpse preserver, where the corpse was surrounded with ice in an attempt to delay decomposition. The Civil War was the first conflict that saw embalmers waiting and working in camps on battlefields, in government hospitals, and in nearby railroad centers to serve the military and families of the dead. Broadsides and advertisements plastered communities, greeting every soldier headed to the front. Some found that a bit demoralizing, and in one instance, General Butler ordered the embalmer to stop with the advertisements. No surprise there. William Bell, as we have met, and then there's Richard Burr. Richard Burr was in Frederick, Maryland. He operated for a time out of the building in Frederick that now houses the National Museum of the Civil War Medicine, and is the practitioner shown in this photograph here from Gettysburg. His poor business practices led the U.S. Army to establish a licensing system for embalmers and to regulate fees charged by battlefield embalmers. It would be 30 years before individual states developed similar regulations. W.R. Cornelius was based in Nashville, and he took a contract with the Confederate Army to bury their dead soldiers. Embalming had not been introduced in Nashville until the Confederate Army had left. Once Nashville was occupied by the Union, Cornelius took a contract with them to bury the Union dead. He continued to bury the dead throughout the war and had branches in Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. He moved on to embalming in 1862 and used, again, Dr. Holmes' methods. Dr. Daniel Prunk was from Indiana, also settled in Nashville during the war. In addition to his Tennessee business, he sent agents who were trained in his processes to open locations in Georgia and Alabama. The cost to embalm went from $100 charged by Thomas Holmes to as little as $10 by the 1880s. So you kind of see that embalmers were not necessarily doctors or surgeons. They could be anybody. You could pull the book off the shelf, follow the instructions, and voila. So who was Thomas Holmes? Thomas Holmes is considered the father of embalming, not because he invented it, but because he popularized it. And he was also the individual who embalmed Elmer Ellsworth. And I think you probably all know who that was, who took down the flag and was shot and killed. While he was removing a Confederate flag in Alexandria. Holmes' widow also claimed he had embalmed Willie and Abraham Lincoln, but that has not been refuted. But that has been refuted. It is believed that Holmes graduated from the College of Physicians and Surgeons at Columbia University in 1845. His name appears in various New York City directories under physicians and surgeons in 1847. While studying phrenology, he examined the heads of Egyptian mummies, which led him to conclude that embalming could be achieved without the use of hazardous compounds. He experimented with embalming prior to the Civil War and developed an arterial solution, which he sold for $3 per gallon, including the injection apparatus. Holmes stated he was commissioned in the Union Army Medical Corps during the Civil War and that he had joined the 27th Brooklyn Fire Zouaves, but that unit does not appear to have existed. While he may not have been commissioned in the way we think of commissions, he was one of the surgeon embalmers who were permitted by the military to prepare and ship the bodies of the dead. Once Lincoln sanctioned embalming for all fallen troops, Holmes embalmed several thousand bodies. He personally claimed 4,028, although some historians believe this is an exaggerated figure. Holmes' technique became widely known and was endorsed throughout the US. He would sell the rights to use his technique for $100. But if you wanted instructions, that was another $200. From this enterprise, he amassed a small fortune. Pierre Cazenave used Holmes' process in 1856, as well as two other undertakers in New Orleans. In 1863, William Bell expressed an interest in Holmes' process. Holmes stated that if Bell was a loyal Union man, he would sell him the rights to use the process within 50 miles of New Orleans for $1,000 plus 1/3 of the receipts. The fluid and embalming instruments would be sent free. Bell thought the fee was a little high and wanted to test it before signing a contract to make sure it would work in a southern climate. Negotiations between Holmes and Bell collapsed. However, in the fall of 1863, Bell later examined a body embalmed by Holmes in New York and sent to New Orleans. Bell found the body not fit to look at. After the war, Holmes returned to Brooklyn, very rich. He died in 1900 and is buried at Cypress Hill Cemetery in Brooklyn. So let's look at the tools of the trade. You probably, if you've been into the museum, you probably recognize this embalmer kit, which is on loan from the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and it's on display at our museum. You'll also notice the advertisement over on the side that shows all of their instruments and cases and everything they could possibly need to be an embalmer. So let's talk about the funeral. A funeral was not just a funeral. It could be considered a social event to which one was invited and offered a family another way to impress their community. Funerals were also often a sign of the family's wealth and or community influence. There was also social expectation for funerals, such as memorial cards, announcements, and invitations. And you'll see here that we have memorial card advertisement. We have an invitation there for an individual's funeral. There was a specific occupation to deliver funeral notices, invitations, and mourning cards. In New York, this occupation was inviter to funerals. While this was a very early occupation, in 1879, the Manual of Social and Business Forms still encouraged the use of private messenger to deliver funeral invitations. So we have, they do everything: portrait copying, mourning stationery, prayer cards. They had everything that you could possibly need for your funeral at some of these places. Funerals in the mid to late 19th century often took place in the home or at a church. Funeral homes, as we know them, didn't become prevalent until the late in the century. A great book about the rise of funeral homes called Preserved: A Cultural History of the Funeral Home in America by Dean Lampros is a great history on the development of the home and why they were placed where they were and why they were using old houses. There were many things to decide on for a funeral besides where it was held. Decisions such as choice of the casket, the elaborateness of the ceremony, the selection of pallbearers, the number of carriages to be procured, and the precedence of mourners in the funeral procession. So remember, this is a social status kind of thing. So you had to be very aware of the social standing of individuals so they know who went first behind the deceased. There were many options as to where to get a casket. They could be chosen from a catalog or the undertaker's display room or stock room. In larger cities, manufacturers were setting up casket showrooms to which undertakers could take their clients, kind of like a car showroom. Here you go. This is what you have to choose from. You probably want to pay attention because you notice I have these named differently. The coffin, it's a wooden coffin. It's got that weird shape to fit the shoulders. That is a coffin. When things started getting fancy and they were made of other materials and they were decorated, then that was a casket. So when you start reading things, you might want to keep that in mind. Mass-produced metal caskets eventually came into use, but many protested as the metal casket did not allow for a timely disintegration of the coffin or its contents. The switch from the wooden coffin to mass-produced caskets appears to have changed between 1860 and 1870 based on furnishing undertaker advertisements. And remember, I mentioned before, the furnishing undertakers provided the supplies needed. One company, Fisk Metal Coffin, cost $7 to $40. Even though cabinet and carpenter shops may still have produced wooden coffins, by the mid-century, their dominance began to wane. Wooden caskets were made of polished hardwoods, such as oak, mahogany, walnut, or rosewood. Mourners could also find caskets of glass and wooden caskets covered in broadcloth or velvet in a wide range of colors, such as purple, blue, and lavender. Of course, black fabric was available for adults, and white was quite often used for children. By 1860, there were patents for caskets made of iron, cement, marble, artificial stone, potter's clay, zinc, glass, and combinations of these materials. Before the end of the century, the list grew with elastic materials, vulcanized rubber, fabricated metals, paper mache, aluminum, and celluloid. So on this slide, not everyone could afford an elaborate funeral. So the first image we have is a child's coffin and it's being carried to the cemetery by two gentlemen. I'm going to assume it's an undertaker and his assistant. And the impoverished mother is walking around behind those individuals. The second image is 1870s Virginia, and it's showing an African-American family taking the body in a wagon to the cemetery. By the first quarter of the 19th century, carriages and hearses became more widely used in transporting people and the deceased. Until the Civil War, the manufacturing of hearses was, like undertaking, a sideline of carriage manufacturers. Some undertakers owned their own carriages and hearses, others rented them. The style of hearses changed with fashion every few years, requiring manufacturers to continue producing new models. So we're going to have a sale on the 2010 automobile, and we've got the new 2025s for you guys to come look at. So it's pretty much like an automotive manufacturing. And here we have some samples. We have the white hearse, which would have been for a child, the darker one, and then we have one just in case it was in the middle of winter. We have an individual that has a mourning coach, a furnishing undertaker, funeral carriage master. He has funeral featherman, which we'll talk about, and he's also the furnishing undertaker. And he mentions that he has all these different things: coffin cloths, shrouds, and every other requisite, thus securing advantages that cannot be obtained by any other house in the city. Oops, sorry. By the first quarter of the 19th century, carriages and hearses became more widely used. Oh, I went over that. Sorry. In Atchison, Kansas, an electronic trolley was refitted to become a funeral car to Mount Vernon Cemetery. The fee ranged from $8 to $10 based on the distance and time involved. Additional trolley cars could be obtained for mourners, but were of the usual trolley design. By the 1890s, most major cities in the U.S. used trolleys as a mode of transportation to the cemetery. Hearses up until the Civil War were almost always black. After the war, variations of color were introduced. Children's hearses were produced in white, and the larger hearses stayed with the darker colors, the most popular combination being black with fine lines of silver or gold. Undertakers preferred their carriage and hearse drivers in a form of livery. Funeral livery included a black broadcloth or doeskin coat, trousers, and vest. The coat and vest were single-breasted and buttoned up to the neck. The drivers would wear a linen garrote shirt collar and black silk tie, black kid gloves, and black top hat. Few independent undertakers could afford to keep enough drivers, let alone dress them, so they would hire drivers from carriage stables, and the people they got for that sometimes were not all that trustworthy and probably did not show the respect that the undertaker had hoped. And it was enough of a problem that early trade journals discussed this issue and trying to figure out how to stop it. So earlier in this presentation, we went over the cost of the undertaker services, but we really didn't talk about the specific funeral costs. One bill from 1862 included costs for placing the corpse in the coffin, $8.50, and $80 to transport and deposit the corpse in the tomb or grave, including 2 horses and 5 miles. Additional charges also included for males washing, shaving, and dressing, and for females for casketing and dressing. So you see here we've got one of the bills we saw earlier. Then we have this other bill here that they were charging for professional mourners, individuals they hired to fill up the church if it was scarce, pallbearers, feathermen, which we'll discuss, gloves, the chairs, and transportation. Oh, hold on, sorry. Okay, we're going to talk about pallbearers. We kind of explained the meaning of the word. So these individuals may have been known to the family, or they may have been relatives. Friends and family involved as pallbearers would not have a cost associated with them. However, in some instances, for whatever reason, the pallbearers had to be hired. The number of pallbearers was determined by the number of handles on the casket. So if you got a big expensive casket with, I don't know, 8 or 10 handles, you better have 8 or 10 pallbearers. The number of, usually it was 6 or 8. The pallbearer's job was to carry the casket from the house to the hearse and then to the grave. On occasion, children may be the pallbearers for a deceased child. You'll also notice the cost of gloves, and the gloves were issued to the pallbearers, as occasionally were scarves, as I don't want to say mementos, but as a gift for their services. So featherman, what is a featherman? A featherman can refer to the person leading the funeral procession, similar to another staff person that could be, or another occupation called a mute, which I did not go into detail right now. Except the staff he carried would be topped by black ostrich feathers. The term also refers to individuals who provides the plumes to the horses and the hearse itself. And you're probably familiar with images of hearse and the horses with all the feathered plumes and everything all over the place. The feathers were an important symbol in the late 19th century funeral procession. The color and number of plumes indicated the status of the deceased. An absence of plumes indicated the person was poor. 2, he was of moderate circumstances. 3 to 4, he was fairly well-to-do. 5 to 6, well off. 7 to 8 plumes, he was rich. Burials could be in a churchyard, in a church graveyard, a formal rural cemetery, or on land set aside by a family for family burials. And we kind of touched on that a little bit about how individuals would establish burial grounds on their property behind the house or in the woods. It's important to know that a graveyard is just that. It's a yard full of graves, like the church graveyard. A cemetery is much more formal. It made it more comfortable to bury individuals. Graveyards usually were in the churchyard, and they were probably haphazardly put together. Sometimes husbands were not going to be buried next to their wives. They could have been in different parts of the cemetery or the graveyard, because that's where there was room. Churchyard grave plots were not purchased as with the later cemeteries. The grave itself was most often dug and covered by the pallbearers. Cemeteries are planned and meant to appear as a park. This was called the rural cemetery movement. It began, I think, in 1850s. They were usually at the time of conception outside of city limits, often called rural cemeteries. Plots in these cemeteries, as now, could be purchased in advance, ensuring families could be buried near each other. Cemeteries also eventually had hired staff to dig the graves and supervise the digging and covering of the grave. So the grave diggers, you'll notice there we have a payroll sheet to see how much they were being paid. Usually they were just day workers that they would be hired, usually working class or immigrants. And then cemeteries eventually hired staff to be official grave diggers. One such man was Joseph Lincoln. Very little is known about Joseph. He was the first regular employee of the Otterbein Cemetery in Westville, Ohio. It is believed he was born into slavery in 1811 or 1812 in Virginia, and by 1870 he was in Westerville and listed as a farm laborer in the 1870 census. Lincoln was hired as a janitor by Otterbein Cemetery in 1879. He was more of a caretaker, visiting the cemetery once a day and supervising the cleaning of vaults and the digging of the graves. He died in 1883 and is buried in Otterbein Cemetery. So once the grave was dug and covered, most individuals wanted some kind of a marker. Early grave markers were made of stone and required a stone cutter or carver. The stone cutter traveled from job to job and city to city following the availability of work. Some became permanent fixtures in the towns, doing more instead of following the availability. I'm so sorry. Some became permanent fixtures in their towns, doing more than just gravestones. They were doing other types of stonework. And some of these artists would actually sign their work. So if you see a gravestone with the name down at the bottom, that is probably the stone cutter or the carver. The Industrial Revolution spurred the development of mass-produced cast markers. These could be ordered through a catalog of the undertaker's stock or from a manufacturer. Even Sears and Roebuck offered monuments through their catalog. These monuments were made of bronze or zinc. The metal monuments were becoming more popular than the stone markers as they were lighter and cheaper. To combat this loss of business, the stone industry managed to convince some of the larger cemeteries to allow only stone markers. You probably have seen some of these markers if you visit cemeteries. They're very beautiful and they hold up really, really well. In the last quarter of the 19th century, a section of the population, mostly made up of physicians and sanitarians, became concerned that in-ground burials were causing disease and contaminating the drinking water. This reasoning not only drove the creation of the rural cemeteries, it also spawned an interest in cremation. Cremation was not an altogether popular alternative for the disposal of the corpse. By 1900, over 13,000 cremations had taken place, but that was still less than 1% of the total deaths for that 15-year period. In 1876, Dr. Francis Lemoyne built the first crematory in the U.S. in Washington, Pennsylvania. The crematory was in use until 1900 and completed 42 cremations. Baron de Palm, a German theosophist, was the first cremation not long after the completion of the crematory in 1876. Now, this building obviously is still standing. You can visit it and you can go inside. Unfortunately, I did not understand the process for making an appointment to get inside. I misread it and I didn't get to go inside, but I'm assuming that it would be really cool. So if you ever make it to Washington, you probably are Washington, PA, you might want to stop there and call the Washington Historical Society and make your appointment. In 1876, Dr. Francis Lemoyne, in 1881, the New York Cremation Society was established, followed by the United States Cremation Company. Cremation societies were being established all over the country, made up of Germanic groups, Protestant clergymen, and a large number of the medical profession and sanitation workers. So, here we are. We have some of the occupations in the business of death morphed into other things or are no longer around. Undertakers eventually came to be called funeral directors and were a supplier of funeral necessities, and at the same time starting to become a popular and starting to become a provider of directions, definitions, and ideas for appropriate ceremonial actions. Morticians took on the roles of the embalmer. There are so many occupations that in some way benefited from death: dressmakers, milliners, secondhand clothing shops, stationers, machinists, florists. So there's a lot of other people that were commercializing death and making money. I do want to point out this last broadside. This is authentic to the time. It is not, it's a reproduction of the actual broadside, but it is from the time. And it really kind of made me laugh. They are still maintaining the undertaker duties in addition to a closely related business and fine cabinet work. And don't forget to ask about their layaway plan. So if you can't afford them, ask for a layaway for your burial. Any questions?
If anybody has any questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself and feel free to ask. We'll try to keep things organized, or if you would like to put them in the chat. Somebody said great program in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Not that I had anything to do with it. Next question was Lincoln put on ice in his funeral train?
I'm not sure. I'm sorry. I do know that he must have been, because he stood up really well, even with the embalming, and they did have to do touch-ups to his face at various stops. But I haven't seen anything referencing a refrigerator or having him on ice. I'm sorry.
What was Dr. Holmes' embalming fluid? A secret recipe?
Yep. He would not like he charged for it, so he wouldn't tell anybody what he was putting in that.
Great presentation, very informative, learned some new
Thank
things. Then the response about the ice on the funeral train was that they were told that on a haunted tour in Alexandria, Virginia.
I will have to look further and put it into this if he was put on ice. And I don't even know if he might have when he was lying in state as well, because it appeared he was on a pedestal of some type. So there was room for refrigeration to be there.
Please do part 2 on mourning customs.
Yeah, that was another rabbit hole that I need to go down, because there's a lot of myths and word of mouth things out there about mourning that just aren't true. So mourning is a very interesting topic. So yeah, I do need to get into researching that one after my next presentation next summer.
And certainly went through a lot of like a great evolution in the 19th century,
Oh,
especially with the
definitely.
rural cemetery movement and Victorian and picnics in the park. They were like cemeteries were like recreational parks.
They were
It was,
parks.
you know,
Yeah. That was the intention, is that they wanted to be peaceful and calm. So when you went to visit your loved ones, it was a nice experience. And so yeah, they were definitely well designed for that purpose. And some people, and it was very much um divided by income. So if you were very rich, you had your own little plot over here with your family name and your giant obelisk in the middle. You weren't quite so rich, but you wanted to be in the cemetery where everybody else was, you may have a smaller plot that's not bricked in or not fenced in. So it's really an interesting study of the social status of the community as well.
absolutely. You walk through, in Gettysburg, Evergreen Cemetery, or if you go to Philadelphia, Laurel Hill Cemetery. I mean, to go through there, it's just absolutely incredible. It's a monument garden as much as it is a cemetery, and
Uh-huh.
really, those rural cemeteries, they really were beautiful and wonderful place for these Victorian mourning practices. But anyway, does anybody else have any questions? No? Okay. Well, if you do have any questions, please feel free to email us if you want Annette's email address. It's ajorgensen@seminaryridge.org, or if you just send us an email through the contact us form, she does receive that as well. So thank you all very much for participating this evening, joining us this evening. Join us this weekend for the Gettysburg Address 161st on the Ridge, or join us next week when Robert Hicks speaks with us. And if we don't see you prior or hear from you prior, everybody have a wonderful Thanksgiving. And hopefully we'll see you at the very least at the next History Happy Hour in December. So thank
Thank
you
you,
all very much.
everybody.
Have a great weekend.